Today we have Dr. Gold with us. Dr. Gold is currently a senior professor in the Department of Entomology at Texas A&M University. His responsibilities are for teaching and research programs that involve the integrated management of insects associated with their near environments of humans and their companion animals. Roger accepted the position of professor and endowed chair of urban and structural entomology at Texas A&M University in 1989. He held that position for 25 years until his retirement in January of 2015. He also served as the coordinator for environmental programs, director of the Water Center, and head of the Department of Entomology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He began his academic career in entomology at the University of Arizona in Tucson in 1974, where he worked as an extension specialist and researcher. There, his program emphasized certification programs for agricultural and urban pesticide applicators and research in urban entomology. He earned his BS and MS degrees from the University of Utah and PhD degree in entomology from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a member of professional and scientific societies and organizations and has written many papers in both scientific journals and trade publications. He is a frequent presenter at national and international pest management conferences and workshops. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Gold.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity of being here today and participating in another MPMA conference. It's just an honor, and I've had this honor on a number of occasions, but this one is particularly sweet, as I have now retired and basically finding a lot of other things to do with my life, or that's what my wife tells me. Okay? I have a great deal of respect for MPMA and what they do to help us to stay current in our science, teach us how to work with our customers, and how to make a difference through the science and the technologies that we have at our disposal. It's also great to renew old friendships and to see people we don't have an occasion to see every year. In fact, I got to meet Mel Bennett again, whom I've not seen for a number of years. He has a pest control company in Salt Lake City, and last time I saw him was a few years ago when we were at our 50th high school reunion. Now that does age me. But Mel said to me, "Gee, you look just like you did in high school." Now I've thought a lot about that, and now I know why I didn't date back then. For the last 20 or more years, I've had a lot of interest in basically physical and mechanical barriers that can be created to control termite populations. Termites are a major problem in the states where I've worked as a structural entomologist. We also have had a lot of interest in other household pests, including stored product pests. What I'd like to do today is basically talk a little bit our research, what we have found in directions that I would recommend that others kind of consider as they plan their work in this very important profession. A lot of the things that I'll talk to you about are not necessarily new concepts, but we're taking them to a little bit different, a higher level. And it's part of what is known as sustainable building practices. There's a big push at both the state and the government agencies, at the federal agencies, for sustainable buildings as part of the integrated pest management program. Within the recent past, I received a call from the state government about an enlargement of the Hobby Airport near Houston, and there was a specific mandate that they implement integrated pest management programs, and they wanted me to outline for them basically what sustainable meant and what would be some examples of that. And that caused me to reflect on the topic that we'll be discussing today. When the earth was formed or created or big banged, whatever it was, basically there were two major continents. Today, as you look at planet Earth, those original two continents have broken up by what is known as continental drift or tectonic plate movement. The thing that is interesting to me, that planet Earth is in a perfect situation. I marvel at it every day as I get older. that how this thing came to be 1 degree plus or minus in its orbit, we would have disaster, either being too hot or too cold, and we would not be able to survive. So everything works perfectly, including the concept that there were, from the very beginning, natural barriers to the movements of animals and plants in some cases. Some of the natural barriers are the oceans. The vast majority of the surfaces of planet Earth are made up of water. Those prevent a lot of the movement of things that we call pests from one area to another. There are vast deserts that also provide natural barriers. There are mountain ranges all over the world that also prevent barriers. And then there are inclement temperatures and other environmental issues that make it very difficult, particularly for insects to survive on planet Earth. A lot of these natural barriers have been overcome basically by humans due to the intellect and their need to explore and to become involved in commerce. From the very beginning, when people began to spread out using any means of transportation they could, from caravans to boats, whatever it might be, pests began to be spread around planet Earth. And they were able to overcome some of those natural barriers. As a result, we have thousands of introduced species arriving here in our country and other places of the world that came from foreign areas. Cockroaches, some of our stored product pests, certainly the foremost in termites, and then we have some of the mosquitoes, with the mosquitoes being the most deadly animal on planet Earth. More lives are lost due to the pathogens associated with malaria and other diseases than any other cause. One child in 2015 dies every 30 seconds due to this particular mosquito. Today, with our current use of transportation, insects have no problem arriving alive in different areas of the world, including termites. Termites is an area that I have dealt with now for over 40 years in many different states. Termites are fascinating because of the fact that they consume wood, which is considered to be a beneficial aspect because they recycle the nutrient base of the planet. But at the other time, when human beings move from stone, caves or rocks that they would place, basically, and we move to wood, that wood has been susceptible to termites and many other insects. When we build our homes that we call these structures here, we have set up just exquisite microenvironments that support introduced species. Particularly in this picture here, I put it into place because of the mulch that surrounds this house. The mulch is basically a wood source that's attractive to a number of insects that brings them close to this structure. And if we do not prevent them in some way, they will inhabit this space because what is known as conducive conditions. They have all of the resources they need with easy access in the homes that we as humans create. In this regard, I'd like to take just a few minutes and talk about a basic concept that are called the requisites for life on planet Earth. Human beings and insects and all animals and plants are considered to be heterotrophs, meaning that they need to eat something or take it out of the environment in order to get their energy for energy and growth. And we call this food that they have to have. All organisms have to have a source of this energy in order to survive. Another thing that all animals have to have is oxygen. Oxygen is one of the smallest molecules that we'll ever deal with, and it becomes a large part of another resource that we'll talk about in just a moment. But without oxygen, you can't survive but a very few minutes because you will suffocate. The other resource is water, H2O. Again, a very simple molecule made up of hydrogen, 2 parts of that, and oxygen. You have to have water in some form to survive on planet Earth. The other thing we have to have is a favorable environment that's neither too hot nor too cold or too dry or too wet. And we understand these concepts as entomologists because we can use these types of environmental conditions to basically control insects. And so again, we go back to the natural barriers that exist on the planet and remind you again that you have to have environmental conditions that can support life. Or you have to have harborage, where that organism can get out of the environmental conditions that are not conducive to their survival. Now, they have to have others of the same species if they reproduce sexually. Now this means then that as entomologists and professionals that work with pest management, we know that if we can get populations down to low levels, that we basically can stop that population from growing and reproducing. It's one of the things that we do, particularly in controlling things like ants. Because if we can take out the queen, which is the reproductive center, then we can keep that population from recovering. All we have to do, essentially, is to eliminate or to limit access to these requisites for life. Take one of them away, or intoxicate it in terms of putting some type of a chemical in it, or keep the insects from being able to get to them, and you will have accomplished control. The ancients have left us records behind about how they understood and went about this. And so they knew that they could construct vessels out of clay, and they could put their crops in those and seal them. And we know that as the seeds fermented, it created carbon dioxide, which in fact was one of the earliest fumigations that's on record, is the point. They mechanically excluded things by putting them in silos that were tight. So exclusion was one of the things that was used to preserve the requisites for the ancient populations of human beings. The other thing that has been known about for centuries and the eons of time is that there are certain elements on planet Earth that either repel or will kill insects that come in contact with them. Sulfur is described in the literature going back hundreds of years into the biblical ages and beyond, is the point. Now, sulfur is just one of a whole group that are called elements. Another one is copper, which has toxic factors associated with it. Most of us would be concerned when we see arsenic, again, an element. Arsenic has been used for hundreds of years, basically to protect people and their crops. Now, these elements that I have just outlined for you have fallen out of disfavor, and the reasons are obvious, and that is that they are too toxic to be tolerated by human beings and other plants and animals that we wish to preserve. Remember that diversity is the best thing we can have in all phases of our lives and in the lives of the things that we share the planet with. Because with diversity comes establishment and sustainability. Now, the chemicals that I have listed for you are all shown here on a periodic table of the elements. The periodic table basically says that through time, as part of what is called the second law of thermodynamics, everything will deteriorate down to its most basic form, down to the things that are basically listed on this periodic table. Now, I've always been interested where the red, let me see if I can put, well, it doesn't have one, but there's a red arrow on there. AU is the symbol for gold. And that happens to be my last name, and my whole life when people in after chemistry class would say, AU. Now I know what they were talking about. All right. Quite fortuitously, in 1814, Russler and Slater discovered that if you put two of these elemental compounds together, copper and arsenic, that you could create a bright green pigment that painters like to use. In other words, these were paint manufacturers that inadvertently created a product that became known as Paris green. Paris green is very toxic. We would never be able to use it today as it would have been used for those intended purposes originally. And I'll be mentioning things like this that basically have changed the way that we implement and perform integrated pest management procedures. So this is one of the very first commercially available pesticides, Paris green. A long history, both good and bad in terms of things that it's been used for. Eventually, it was discovered that certain plants had chemicals associated with their leaves or their stems or their flowers, including chrysanthemum. We now understand that this very complicated chemical formula that's shown over there to your right is toxic to a number of target pests, but it is still considered to be a green pesticide because of the fact that it is toxic, but it doesn't last very long, and so it breaks down quickly. The reason for this is referred to in science as the law of parsimony. As things get more and more complicated, then it's easier to change one bond, one molecule associated with this, and it loses its toxic capabilities. All right? So all pesticides lose their toxic effects through time because they go back to, again, the second law of thermodynamics, where they revert back to their most basic form. Eventually, we were able to create in the laboratory pesticides again that mimicked the very molecules that had been produced by specific plants. And this is permethrin. Permethrin, again, is very effective, but it degrades through time because it has a complex molecule. Now, we have restricted or removed from the marketplace those chemicals that had the longest activity, things like aldrin and deoldrin and DDT. More recently, we've lost Dursban and a number of other products because they were in the environment too long. Now, while I mourn that, I certainly understand the concerns, because all chemicals, including the ones that I have worked with for many years, known and designated as termiticides, degrade through time. This is a concept that some, as I have visited with in the past, have a problem with, but it is absolutely what happens. The highest concentration of a pesticide in the environment is the first moment that it's mixed with water and applied to the environment. After that first moment, things begin to happen with that chemical that changes its chemical formula and its structure to the point eventually it will become non-toxic. Now, we are concerned about that, particularly if we're giving long warranties or guarantees, when in fact this is one of the blessings that comes from Mother Nature. Things that are toxic break down through time so they don't accumulate. Having said that, with every aspect of the things we have talked about in the last few minutes, there are risks and there are benefits. And some people have a tendency to talk more about the risk versus the benefits. And I'm going to be trying today to be level-handed in all of these aspects. I speak again tomorrow, and I'll go back through this more specifically when we talk about termite control. Because of risk and benefits associated with pesticides, in 1970 we had the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. As part of the creation of this new government agency that not only registered pesticide, but took in data associated with the efficacy and the risk and benefits associated with them. Also, they adopted, as part of the course of human history, at least in the United States, what was called integrated pest management. Integrated pest management in those early days when I basically was beginning my professional career, basically set out to reduce the use of pesticides by at least 50% from the time in the 60s when they were being used exclusively for the management of pests in cotton and large acres of other types of cropping system. IPM technologies or tactics start and are displayed as a pyramid. This pyramid has a base that is focused on cultural and sanitation type procedures. The next level up in the pyramid was physical and mechanical control, followed by biological control with pesticides at the top. The reason that pesticides themselves, these chemical control agent, was put at the top of the pyramid was they were to be used when justified and specifically when needed. Oftentimes we forget about the concept of using them when they are justified. I am very pro-pesticides, let me tell you now. I've seen the development of pesticides over a 45-year professional career. And I've had the privilege of working with these products, and I've seen them change the history of human society by protecting humans from pests of all kinds. But I also understand that in my lifetime working in cotton in Arizona, that basically in cotton we applied parathion and toxaphene every Thursday. It was called spray day. And you could go outside and you could smell this around the areas in Arizona, and you'd say, it's Thursday. And those were called insurance treatments, where it was cheaper to go out and spray than essentially to go out and count the insects and determine. Well, that's not the way it is anymore because of integrated pest management. Now, I'm going to refer to these concepts for the next several minutes as we make our way through this material. So, on the base of cultural and sanitation methods, mechanical and physical things that we can do to exclude insects, biological control, and then pesticides when they're needed. Now, I come back to a statement I made earlier in this presentation. There's an interest right now in sustainable building practices, which are part and to be thought of as part of an IPM approach to the management of insects in and around homes and structures. By sustainable, we basically understand, and the government has taught us, that they must be effective pest exclusions. In other words, they can't just be something that we do to say that we're doing IPM. They need to be efficacious and or effective. They need to have long-term efficacy, meaning that instead of being a few years like pesticides would be, that they would go on for decades or longer. They need to be environmentally sound, meaning that when they deteriorate, as all things do on planet Earth, that there will not be toxic residues left behind. And low maintenance is certainly one of the things that they need to stress because of the fact that there are costs associated with everything that we do. The initial cost and some of the sustainable approaches can be considerable, but through time, those costs are offset. So that's kind of where I would like to go. I mentioned the innovation of Paris Green and how it came out of an entirely different industry. Here is a mechanical exclusion type of device called a window screen. It was first described in 1823 merely as woven wire for windows, known as window screens. This concept came out of the sieve industry, which had a lot to do with the millings of grains and other types of things where that they needed to be sized. In 1861, Gilbert and Bennett Corporation produced the first commercial screens. In the recent past, in preparing for a class that I still teach, even in retirement, talking about how insects have changed the history of the world, There's a book called Yellow Fever in the South, which is an excellent read. The authors of those books say that one of the things that made the biggest difference in the 18 and 1900s was the simple manufacture and commercial development of window screens to go on the windows in the South. The other thing that they mentioned was air conditioning and television, particularly in the later years. The reasons were simple, and that is that in the South, where it's hot and humid in the evenings, people would sit on the porch and actually talk to one another. Interesting concept. Well, now at least they go inside, where the window screens keep the insects away from them, and you air condition and watch television. So window screens is one of the practical aspects of the types of devices that would exclude insects. This concept has been reduced to practice in our industry through products such as Termimesh and other related products. Termimesh actually is a type of a wire screen, in this case made out of stainless steel or non-corrosive types of metals, that literally keep the termites from being able to come through the building site. This has been manufactured and sold for many years, and I can tell you that having a son that lives in Hawaii, that this is a common practice where the property and the cost of housing is so great that you can afford to use this type of a long-term impediment to termites getting into structures. Now, Termimesh comes in many forms. You can cover the entire building site, or in some cases it can be put around plumbing penetration where it's caught in the concrete and keeps termites from being able to use the plumbing penetrations to get into the structures. A proven commodity as being effective in excluding termites from homes. Another product that has been used, we referred to as aggregate or granular barriers. These type of barriers have been used for long periods of time. In fact, when I began to look at the literature on these things, Walter Ebling, oftentimes referred to as the father of urban entomology, published his first paper in 1957 about using different sizes of aggregate to literally keep insects out of structures. This has been followed up by a number of people that have taught and spoken at these conferences in years past. And we just recently had a publication in 2013 where we did an extensive piece of work working with engineers, essentially, at Texas A&M University in looking at different ways to reduce termite incursion into structures in our state. So, that having been said, these termite barriers have been reduced to practice and are marketed in Australia and in Hawaii. When I began to speak about termites in Texas 25 years ago, we were looking for a source of these materials that we could either bring in from the existing sources, or that we could manufacture, or that we could harvest, as it's referred to, from natural sources near our state. The biggest problem with these types of aggregate barriers is the cost of shipping, particularly over long distances. Again, the concept has been proven by numerous researchers. We have taken these different sizes of materials from different sources and evaluated them in bioassays in the laboratory. And now, these types of approaches of using these barriers essentially have been reduced to practice with materials that we were able to find in the state of Texas from local sources. But what we find is, by going to the internet, that there's a lot of misinformation. That we talk about aggregate sources or sand, and there it just says that you can, in the internet, in several sites, it just says that you can use sand. Our sand in our work, in our bioassays, is actually the non-treated control. And they go through sand very rapidly, they being the termites. So many people on the list of the researchers I just presented to you have looked at what are the sizes, the shapes, and the configurations of these granules. Displayed here for you are what we call ASTM screens. The concept is fairly simple. You can go to a source of small aggregates and you can screen them to get the slot, is what we refer to it, which are sizes 8, 10, and 12 mesh. These sizes appear to be too large to get a hold of, and the space between them when they are put into place are too small to get through. And so they are a physical barrier to the movement of the termites. Also shown here is another way to get these sizes, and that is to manufacture them. In other words, you literally can take stone and have it crushed and screened to get the sizes that you need. So again, the important information has been discovered by many people through the last several of years. 8, 10, and 12 does not make sand, but some of these sizes are in sand, so we need to harvest or be able to produce the sizes that we need. The next concept is one that is called angularity. Again, working with engineers at Texas A&M University, I have now been educated on angularity. Angularity is irregular shapes. So the more angular a product is, an aggregate, the more sharp edges that it has, and the better it compacts or stays in place. And so we know that the slot, again, the angularity, needs to be greater than 3,200 on a unit scale of 1 to 7,000. A perfectly oval size has an angularity of 1, and something that has no flat surfaces has an angularity of 7,000. And again, the reasons for this are several, but the important thing is that they be able to pack together when you combine sizes 8, 10, and 12. That's the key point. The next one is called the interstitial space. The interstitial space is actually the space between these pieces of aggregate of a given size. When you mix the aggregates together in the 8, 10, and 12, you reduce the spaces between the aggregates. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about how you actually measure the interstitial space, but it's done volumetrically using Archimedes' principle. That's more than you wanted to know. But the point being is, if the spaces are too small for the insects to get through, it creates an impenetrable area that will keep the termites from being able to get to their requisites of life. Now, we have also discovered that manufactured sand has the best angularity because of the fact that it's a fractured material. It actually can have sharp edges. And there may be some other good consequences of that. But the interstitial spaces, we now understand, need to be around 40% voids. The good thing about having void areas is that these surfaces will drain so that you're not holding water against the structure, which actually is creating a conducive condition. So the barriers that seem to work best in terms of mechanical exclusion also help in reducing other requisites against that structure. Now, a concept that is pretty straightforward, and that is that if we can establish a barrier around a structure using these specific sized aggregates with the specifications that I've outlined for you, we essentially will keep the termites from being able to penetrate that barrier. So you can use them on the exterior, or in the pre-construction phases, they can be established on the inside of the building and around the plumbing penetrations. Now, the good news is that these types of materials are elements. They're elemental, silicon and other types of rock. They don't degenerate through time, and so they will last for extended periods of time. Many years ago, again, back in about the year 1999, as I recall, working again with engineers from Texas A&M University, I became interested in creating a building practice that would reduce the compatibility and the attractiveness of structures to foraging termites. Already out there were what were called insulated concrete forms. They're actually made out of styrofoam, and I'll show you the configuration in just a second. This is a building that has been built up out of insulated concrete forms, and across from it there to your right is that you can put any veneer that you want on these, including the brick that's depicted here. But there's limited cellulose in the structure, so it has no food value. Now, through time, we constructed houses, first mock-ups, and then later this full-sized house right here. And we determined that because there are many manufacturers of these forms, that termites may not be able to get any food from them, or food value, but they would tunnel in the styrofoam and they would pick away at it. And particularly, the one here that's on your far left, you can see that it has styrofoam bridges that go all the way through it. So literally, the termites could dig through the styrofoam and make it to the internal veneers, the sheetrock. They'd eat the paper off of sheetrock and get into other wooden members of the structure. Okay? So I gave a presentation in 1999, something in that period of time, about ways that we potentially could keep the termites from penetrating into these types of a unique construction. One of the things that we proposed and actually ended up being done is that in the molds where these forms were made, they added boric acid. And boric acid actually did prevent a type of a long-term pesticide that would protect these structures. The problem is the boric acid interfered with the adhesion of these very specific types of materials that make up styrofoam. And so it worked, but it wasn't practical in terms of long-term sustainability. The reason for this long part of the story is that following the paper that I gave on the pros and cons of this type of construction, I met a man who came up to me. His name is John Muncaster, of a company that's called Polyguard. And he said, you know, we're in a non-related industry entirely, but we make these types of membranes that are used to waterproof large structures. We also make membranes that will coat pipe, like in the oil field pipe where they do the welding, the heat destroys the factory applied types of membranes, and they can reestablish that membrane. And these membranes would stick to metal and wood and concrete. They're also used in the construction industry on highways. Okay, I'm open to this. I was working with engineers. Why not think in a little bit different direction? By the way, just for the record, if you ask an engineer a question, he or she will go to a book and look it up. If you ask an entomologist a question, we'll go do a research project. There aren't any books to answer these kind of questions from our perspective. Okay, so Mr. Muncaster came to us shortly after this presentation, and he presented to us a concept that they apply these waterproofings on the outside of these insulated concrete forms, particularly when they go below grade. And he reported that they had no evidence of termites being able to go through these very specific membranes. And then he asked us, he said, We make a product that has what is called elastomeric properties. It sticks and it can move without breaking the seal that holds it in place. And these particular membranes will adhere to a lot of different kinds of substrates. Well, the first thing I began to think of is that how could we test this? So one of the very first things we do at this time, as I look back, was oversimplified. But we took yellow pine, which is highly susceptible to termite feeding. We wrapped it in this material, and we buried them in 4 different places in Texas that represented different climates and different kinds of termites, including along the coastal areas with Formosan termites. Through time, every year we'd go dig up part of them and tear them apart, and we would rate them as to the amount of termite damage versus the untreated controls, which weren't wrapped in this material. I can tell you that by the 2nd or 3rd year, most of the controls had been entirely consumed. All that was left was the metal tag that we put in the ground so we could find the treatment sites with a metal detector. After 5 years, when we opened up the sachets with these, there was 0 damage to the wood. Well, I got excited about those potential in terms of being able to build termites out with some of these membranes. It also, we have a terrible problem in our part of the world that are called heaving slabs because of extremes in moisture and temperatures and so forth. Our concrete slabs have a tendency to break. And there's really not a good way to repair those that's cost effective, particularly as it relates to our industry. But all of us here that work with termites know that these cracks become a major issue when it comes to termite control, particularly when the crack will run underneath one of the construction members known as a sill plate. That's a source of wood, and they're very difficult to detect. What I learned from Mr. Muncaster and the people that worked with him is the fact that these membranes adhere very well to concrete and that you can cover that crack, and the termites do not chew through it. And so it became a permanent barrier in this situation. The next concept that Mr. Muncaster and his staff had, well, we can use these types of membranes to deal with plumbing penetrations and the access that many insects, including termites, use. Fire ants in our part of the world use plumbing penetrations to get into buildings as well. And by using these membranes, which are adhesive, and using what are called micro meshes, they came up with a system that could be installed post-construction. A lot of the other products that were available in terms of the meshes were all pre-construction. So after the fact, this could be done, is the point. The other thing that they had developed as part of their industry and working with waterproofing and sealing were these elastomeric ceilings, which are perfect in terms of working with plumbing penetrations. Again, working with engineers, I've learned that when you have 2 materials that are made out of different products, like the PVC pipes and concrete, they have different expansion coefficients. And therefore, before long, there's a crack that forms around all of these plumbing penetrations that are encased in concrete. Then they used a product developed from another part of their industry to seal these, and so as the slab expands and contracts, that they basically are sealed out. They have now developed a line of products. I just messed up, didn't I? A line of products by Polyguard. And I can say to you that through the years that Mr. Muncaster has funded the projects that we have done to evaluate the various aspects of these things that I presented to you. So I know that in the laboratory and where we've reduced them to practice in the real world, that they appear to be working. Now, we're into this a few years in terms of from 1999 through today, that basically these things have worked. So they have a line of products called Term. This is not an advertisement on my part. I'm merely saying to you that we've done the research, and it appears as though some of these granular products and some of these elastomeric types of membranes are working very well in the exclusion processes. Their goal now has moved to actually to build out pest with these sustainable systems. This has been a very important undertaking on their part. And it's been an ambitious and expensive undertaking for them to bring this to light and to the industry. It all started basically with sand barriers and with some of these elastomeric materials used in plumbing penetration. It has now expanded far beyond anything that I could have visualized, certainly. And we understand, because we've used them now in research settings, that they last for many years. What they have in mind in doing now is basically they have expanded the concepts with the research to back it up, to use as an envelopment for buildings, all the way from the exterior to the interior. And the technology exists, and basically I think that you may want to consider the fact that this may have a part in your business as well. The first ones had to do with building this envelope. And we started this particular work in the year 2000 and working with the Polyguard team. Now, we began that testing, and it's classified basically as non-chemical, and by regulators it's referred to as being a device. So it's a non-pesticide type situation. The other part of this is the fact that you can seal vulnerable areas of a structure in such a way that the pests that are invading, that we can reduce basically the incursion of all kinds of pests into these areas. Like anything that we use in our integrated pest management in this industry, then the application is precise. You have to follow the recommendations on how to preserve basically these membranes and structures. And they're labor intensive initially. But these costs are basically, through time, become something that is very realistic. The other aspect of this, it basically goes to the building codes, essentially tell us that screened openings need to be vented. In other words, structures need to be able to breathe. Now, I'm going to go to another topic before I follow this up. I showed you a picture of an insulated concrete home. That home was my home. And what I learned was that if you do not ventilate that home with very specific things like dehumidifiers or running the air conditioner, that it's a sealed structure. And therefore, I got educated in Rockport, Texas, where that thing is built, and at Berkeley, and I can't afford to get any smarter, is the point. And so, we need buildings that breathe, but we have to be able to keep these pests from doing the damage that they do. And this is certainly true in Texas. So by reducing the sizes, by using, again, the polyelastic type materials and micro screening, we know that you can essentially build them out through time. I have received the calls from state and federal government where they're asking about how can we implement these sustainable systems. And I'm pleased to say that now when they call, I have something that I can refer them to, is the point. In all levels, both pre-construction and post-construction. These are not the only products that basically can be used, but this is a line of products that's new to our industry that basically is trying to give us some tools that we can use in this particular situation. So it all comes back to the IPM pyramid. The IPM pyramid is based on cultural and sanitation. I still believe that when we're dealing with termites that we need to simplify the exterior of structures. We cannot have wood-to-ground contact and not think that termites will be drawn to those areas. The other thing is that there are mechanical and physical things that we have described here today. There are a number of products that you can buy to do this, and we're just discussing them in a way that presents research that we have done over the last several years. Pesticides, I still believe, are very important. Pesticides are really, anyway, if you look at it, that they are a substitute for labor. And pesticides have the advantage of being quick, effective, but they have the disadvantage that they break down through time. In post-construction type situations, it's very difficult to reestablish the chemical barriers, essentially, that have broken down through time. Again, it's redundant, but the aldrins, deodorants, and chlorodanes are gone. We do not have chemicals that last for long periods of time that are used as chemical barriers. Summary and conclusions is that the goal of our industry is to protect the health and the property of our clients. Our goal never has been, nor will it ever be, to kill all of the insects that are in the environment. Sometimes we kind of lose track of what the goal is. We need to protect the properties of our clients. Sustainable approaches to IPM are part of the future for professional pest management. They've been used for a number of years, some of the products, and here's another group of products that could be used. Through the use of granular barriers and elastomeric membranes, we can solve very difficult problems with pest intrusion. Again, perhaps I'm easily impressed, but when I found that there was actually a way that we could deal with cracked floors, this was a revelation to me, because of the other ways to do that are very, very expensive. And again, there's a cold joint between where you patch, and so you end up chasing the same problem. These membranes will stretch, and therefore basically will solve this type of a problem. Sustainable technologies are an excellent opportunity for add-on services in our industry as well. Now, each of you come from a different state with different laws and regulations, so that when I mention add-on services, please understand that if your state requires that if you're going to do work with cracked floors or other types of insulation and so forth, it could potentially involve other licenses. So I just say to you that there are products that you can use to help solve some of these products. I've tried then to leave time, which I have done, to basically answer any questions that you might have. So we have a few minutes. Anything at all? Yes, sir.
When you have an area where a tile is and you have a crack like you were talking about, would you use the caulking gun and then drive over that?
Okay. His question is outstanding. Thank you. He asked if you come on a crack, which you know that the termites are using, basically, would you use the caulking type material, or would you use the membrane type material? And the answer is that either of them would work. Personally, I like the membrane material because you have a wider surface area, and I know that it adheres to concrete very well. And if I can take more movement from essentially from the membrane. But both of them would have a potential of solving that problem. Okay? Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, hi, Chris.
Hi, Roger. Has the building industry bought into this yet? Have they changed any of their building codes and so on to take advantage of some of these elastomeric membranes and different mesh granules to essentially insect-proof the house?
You heard his question, and the answer is they're starting to. Particularly the membranes are starting to be used because they're very versatile. And again, Polyguard made a line of products, again, that I have a lot of faith in. They make a product that's an underlayment that goes on the concrete before you lay tile, ceramic tile on your floors. As a result of that membrane, the slab can move, or the concrete can move, and the crack does not come through to the tile. And again, that's how I basically was introduced to some of these concepts, because we have horrible cracking problems in our area of the country, and I have no loose tile, was one of the amazing things.
Okay, with a post-construction treatment, I posed this to the term folks earlier, you pull up all of the flooring so that you can find your existing cracks on your slab foundation, including the one that invariably is going to happen around pretty much the entire perimeter of the structure. So now you get all of those sealed, they put the wood floors, they put the carpet, tile, whatever back down, and you know 20 minutes later, you don't know if a new one is formed. How, without putting an entire barrier as if it was pre-construction, how are you keeping that done? You know, that barrier protected? And then I have a second kind of related question.
A very good question, and the answer is you cannot know. Other than cracks occur very early in the life of a slab. And basically, as the slab ages, we get fewer cracks. Most of them come during the curing process. But your point is well taken. The best situation would be to put the membrane down in the post but pre-construction before you have all of the sill plates and everything laid down. Yeah.
And then the second, I know probably nobody else has a problem with customers wanting to mulch up to the windowsills and, you know, the silt and leaves building up a foot deep up next to the house. What I saw downstairs looks like it would be very effective in the laboratory, but I'm having a hard time seeing customers that are going to keep that barrier clean, keep that, you know, they come in with a leaf blower and shoot, all of a sudden a 5-inch trench of gravel's been blown across the neighborhood. Is that something that in practice people are able to get customers, or is this something that just has been laboratory white coats and done scientifically?
No, we have reduced it to practice where it's gone to the field. And again, you have to tell people that that barrier is to be kept intact. And this comes, and thank you again, that's exactly right. There's some maintenance associated with it. But the maintenance can come from you. And that is, we never recommend that you leave any type of a termite control measure uninspected for long periods of time. And so in your routine inspections, if there are areas that have been blown out by leaf or dug up by a dog, you have the material, and I would see this, that you would have some on the truck, and then you can reestablish that barrier for which there's a charge. And so it's a recurring profit center for you, both the inspection, which you do anyway, and trying to keep this barrier in place. But excellent point. He's bringing the microphone to you. So.
When can you infuse copper in this stuff so we can use it for rodent proofing? Get to the next level.
Okay, his question is, can you use it for rodent proofing? And the answer is, I'm an entomologist. One of the things I've learned after 45 years of being grilled by this industry is I don't know. How's that? Well, thank you again, and I appreciate to be with you.